What is good, YouTube? Today we're going to run you through a tier list of what I think is going to be the meta in Dragonflight for Mythic Plus. We're also going to have some backups as well. We're going to have a meta tier and then we're going to have a subs tier. So if for whatever reason the meta does change with specs getting nerfed, then we have a backup of specs that we can quickly sub in, and they're going to be a pretty safe bet if the meta doesn't stay where it should be right now. I do just want to remind you that I have a Dragonflight Heroic Edition giveaway going on right now. The link will be at the top of the description below, and it will take you to the tweet where all you have to do is follow me on Twitter, retweet the tweet, and sub to me on YouTube, but I'm sure you already are. And then you will be in with a chance of winning yourself a Dragonflight Heroic Edition, so you can get that sweet, sweet mount.
Right before we dive in, 94% of you guys aren't subscribed to the channel, but the more I remind you, the more of you sub. So if you're enjoying the content, drop your boy a sub. We're going to be dropping Dragonflight content every single day, but let's get back on with the video.
Okay, so let's get into the tier list then. Firstly, we are going to start with the Survival Hunter. That's going straight in the meta tier. Just joking. You've had your time, Survival Hunters. Get back down there and go BM. Right, so trolling aside, I'm going to start with the Prot Warrior. That's going straight in the meta tier. Prot Warrior has a pretty strong tier set going into Season 1. They're getting 4% damage and 4% DR for 5 seconds whenever they revenge. So that is their 2 set, which is pretty strong. And then the 4 set is going to grant them a free ignore pain equal to 5% of the damage they actually deal with that revenge. In my opinion, Prot Warrior is probably one of the best tank options for Dragonflight for the first season in Mythic Plus. They have amazing damage, being able to dump their extra rage into huge revenges on AoE, or on single target you can dump it into executes, obviously health permitting on the boss, but Prot is pumping some solid numbers at the moment. I've seen crazy overalls coming out from Prot Warriors on the beta, so that definitely helps in their case to be a meta tank. They are also basically immune to damage. They're one of the best tanks for mitigating physical damage, with having pretty much 100% uptime on shield block now, and bolstering their defensives further with ignore pain. They are just taking basically next to no damage at the moment. And going into Dragonflight, they're actually surprisingly good at taking and dealing with magic damage as well, through abilities like Spell Block and Spell Reflect, now also reducing magic damage you take by 20%. They actually have some decent self-sustain now as well, through being able to talent into Bitter Immunity, a flat 20% heal. This is basically the Kyrian file from Shadowlands that we've been used to. And other talents like Indomitable, just getting passive heals for every rage you spend is obviously pretty massive, especially in an AoE scenario like Mythic Plus, where you're just going to be dumping rage into those big revenges for big damage. Obviously, with how the meta is shaping up for the Season 1 of Dragonflight, which you will see how that plays out from the rest of this video, Battle Shout is going to come in pretty handy. Warriors in general do tend to kind of lack utility that they bring for Mythic Plus, but Battle Shout helps a lot with this. You obviously have Rallying Cry as well, which is a huge defensive cooldown for your party. And they can talent into AoE stops like Intimidating Shout or Shockwave, and then also a single target's done through Stormbolt. Prot Warrior is also one of the more mobile tanks in comparison to the other ones, having access to Charge, Intervene. Obviously you've got Heroic Leap as well, which you can tie to a movement speed when you actually talent into it, which can help them just kite the mobs if they ever do need to. Not that that's going to be useful with how they are currently dealing with damage. So yeah, in general, this tank is a complete powerhouse. From damage to tankiness, it brings some utility and it's got great mobility as well. I don't really think any other tanks can compare with the Prot Warrior at the moment, so they definitely earn themselves a spot in the meta, in my opinion. In saying that though, I do want to have a substitute tank, and for that I'm going to be putting Vengeance in the sub. Just like Prot, Vengeance is dealing some insane damage right now, especially in AoE situations. They are pretty much a DPS class at this stage of Dragonflight. Obviously they have just received a slight nerf, but I still think they're going to be doing some insane damage. They have very competitive single target damage even with the DPS specs. I've seen Vengeance sustaining like 30k on boss fights in Mythic Plus, which some DPS classes are actually struggling to perform at. Their 4 set that they'll be getting in Season 1 as well is actually pretty insane too, giving their Spirit Bomb and Soul Cleave a 12% chance to deal 50% more damage and cause the Vengeance Demon Hunter to take 15% less damage from the mobs the Spirit Bomb hits for 8 seconds, which is actually pretty massive. If you get that proc, which obviously could be seen as a downside being that it is a proc, you'll be dealing some big damage and taking a lot less damage as well. Vengeance is considerably more tanky going into Dragonflight. Vengeance has always suffered with inconsistent damage mitigation through downtime on demon spikes, but this seems to have been fixed in Dragonflight, where they will have a lot higher uptime on on demon spikes, just making them that much more tanky. And if for whatever reason you don't have a demon spikes charge up, then you can fill in the gaps with your demonic windows, obviously gaining insane armor and health with a pretty good uptime on meta as well. They have a lot of passive abilities which just decrease the damage they take in general from physical and magic damage. This comes from passives like Thick Skin and demonic wards, obviously, that we've been used to. And Vengeance arguably has one of the best utility kits in the game, especially for Mythic Plus. I feel like this class was just made around Mythic Plus. They now have, I think it's 4 or 5 AoE stops through Sigil of Chains, Sigil of Misery, Sigil of Silence. You have Chaos Nova as well, which is new to the Vengeance Demon Hunter, which is obviously the mass AoE stun, which Havoc has had in previous expansions. They bring the magic debuff for your party, although I don't know how useful that is going to be in Season 1. No spoilers on what the meta is going to be. They bring Imprison, which is very useful for skips, being one of the only abilities that doesn't put you in combat when you run past a mob, along with abilities like Sap. They can take a lot more offensive talents as well, obviously through the hunt, and then buffing that up with talents like Unnatural Malice or Relentless Pursuit, depending on which one you choose. And obviously Vengeance, out of all the tanks, has always kind of been seen as the king of mobility through having access to 2 of their leaps, just jumping around and kiting about the place if they need to. They have Vengeful Retreat now, which is new to this spec, and obviously they have insane self-sustain while in meta, but also just from your Shattered Souls and picking those up as the fight goes on. So that is why I'm placing Vengeance in the subcategory. Obviously, if Prot receives a nerf, or for whatever reason we go towards a more range-specific meta, then maybe Vengeance could be bumped up into being a meta spec, but for now I'm going to keep it in the subs category. Unfortunately, it also kind of stays down here because of what I'm about to put in next into the meta category. The Havoc Demon Hunter. Obviously, this spec is just pumping some ridiculous numbers now. Literally, you're doing 200k on every pack. It is insane. They have a pretty bland but strong 4-set, just giving you a 20% chance to increase your damage by 8% for 6 seconds. But this is increased to 40% with critical strikes, which is obviously buffed up by the 2-piece. With short cooldowns like Eye-Beam, Immolation Aura, and Essence Break being one of the massive ones, this spec is pumping damage in every single scenario. It is consistent across all fights, both single target and AoE, and like I said, due to the short cooldowns, they are just up for every single pack. So you're going to be topping DPS on pretty much every single pack, whether it's a boss or some trash mobs. They're also one of the specs with the highest self-sustain through passive leech from Metamorphosis and talents like Soul Rending. They have access to Blur as well, which is one of the shortest defensive CDs in the game. And then again, being a Demon Hunter, they just have passive magic damage DR through abilities like Demonic Wards. Obviously, similarly to the Vengeance Demon Hunter, they are unreal for mobility as well. They have access to their double jump, obviously with their wings. They have access to their 2 dashes through Fell Rush, but this is tied into the momentum playstyle, so they might not be up if you need to use these Fell Rushes to get out of a dangerous situation. And then also, obviously, they have Vengeful Retreat as well, but again, this is tied to momentum. So they bring damage, they're insanely tanky, they have great mobility, and the utility they bring is amazing too. They bring Chaos Nova, being a Demon Hunter, and a mass AoE stun. They have a single target stun through Fell Eruption too. They bring a Purge, a ranged kick as well through Disrupt, which I believe is a 15-yard kick. They have Imprison, like I talked about, being able to skip mobs if you need to. And now Havoc also has access to the brand new talent for Havoc specifically in Sigil of Misery, and you can also talent into Sigil of Misery, increasing the damage enemies take from you for 5 seconds after it ends. So that's pretty insane as well, just giving you that extra incentive to actually use some CC. This spec is one of the most complete specs in the game for Mythic Plus, just like I mentioned with the Vengeance Demon Hunter. I feel like these specs were perfectly made for a dungeon scenario. Havoc has insane cleave, insane single target, they're so tanky, and they have definitely earned themselves a spot in the meta. The next spec that I'm going to place in the meta tier, which might come as a shock to some of you, is the Outlaw Rogue. Obviously, being a rogue in general, you have insane utility. The biggest unique one being Shroud if you do need to do any skips, which can help with getting Lust on cooldown if you need to skip a pack. Outlaw has unlimited stops for mobs through obviously a kick, you've got Gouge, you've got Cheap Shot, you've got Kidney Shot, and you've got Blind as well. This spec really doesn't let any cast get off if it's played well. It has a pretty simple rotation in general, in that basically you're just doing your single target rotation all the time. But obviously in AoE situations, you're going to use that Blade Flurry to hit 8 extra mobs and pump out some competitive AoE damage. If you're consistently pulling 5 to 10 targets targets, as an outlaw rogue, you are definitely going to be up there on the meters, potentially competing with the Havoc Demon Hunter. They are very solid across all damage types, especially on bosses as well. Obviously, with how the playstyle works in that you're just doing your single target rotation, you can talent into these single target talents, which is going to buff up your single target damage and really make you perform on boss scenarios. The only drawback with the outlaw rogue is obviously in massive pools you are still target capped. It's improved to 8 targets now, but you are still going to be held back just that little bit. It's not too noticeable because of how much you're actually pumping on up to these 8 targets, but obviously in the massive pools you are going to be held back just that little bit. This doesn't stop the spec though from being at the top of the DPS meter by the end of the key. Being a rogue, you probably have the best defensive toolkit in the game, from evasion to cloak of shadows to feint death if you do actually need it. You also have feint as well to reduce any AoE damage coming your way. You have vanish as well for niche scenarios. If you are victim to a targeted ability, you can just vanish and sometimes avoid the mechanic as a whole. You really will struggle to die on an outlaw rogue. They have great mobility as well. Obviously they have the baseline sprint ability. They now tend to talent into shadow step now as well over grappling hook, just for that instant mobility behind a mob or a friendly target if you need to get out of something. And obviously being an outlaw rogue as well, you have those long arms. Through acrobatic strikes and now also death maneuvers, you can keep a lot better uptime on mobs than other melee specs, and this also obviously helps as well with mob control because you're not going to be out of range for those kidney shots or those cheap shots, so that definitely helps them as well. A solid pick for the meta as always with the rogue. They are definitely up there with the Havoc Demon Hunters. So for my third pick for the meta, unfortunately, I think it is going to be a full melee meta, in that my third pick is going to be the Windwalker Monk. I'm going to drag that straight in the meta tier. Windwalker has been performing insane on the beta right now. They have pretty much unmatched AoE damage, especially in those bigger pools. And also surprisingly for the Windwalker, now they also have great single target as well. Their burst is insane in both scenarios. And if they get the right procs in an AoE situation, they are definitely hard to contend with. Obviously coming into Dragonflight, they are very rich in offensive cooldowns, having access to 3 big offensive cooldowns. And that being, obviously you've got Zwen, 2 charges of Storm, Earth and Fire, which is great for that consistent damage across a dungeon. And unfortunately for some of you, Bone Dust Brute is still a go-to talent. Obviously what seems to be a melee meta, a massive talking point for the Windwalker Monk is obviously Mystic Touch. Just bringing that 5% extra physical damage to all mobs that the Windwalker touches is going to be huge for your Prot Warrior, your Havoc Demon Hunter, yourself, and obviously your outlaw rogue as well. So that is going to have massive value over the course of a key. The rest of their toolkit has some great utility as well, with access to an AoE stun in leg sweep, which is on a pretty short cooldown as well. You obviously have the unique Ring of Peace ability. If your tank ever does need to kite, just bang down the Ring of Peace and he'll be able to stand safely in there while the mobs try and attack him. They have Paralysis, which can be paired with Ring of Peace as well to skip mobs, but also can be used as a stop. And then for some unique scenarios like we had in Shadowlands, in Plaguefall, they have their Detox ability, which is just a poison and disease dispel, which can definitely come in handy if your healer is feeling overwhelmed. Windwalker is actually pretty unique as well, bringing a lot of party buffs to your group. They obviously have the Windwalking ability, which is going to increase your party's movement speed. We've been used to this in previous expansions, but they now also increase your party's avoidance, which is going to be huge for Mythic Plus. And also anyone in 10 yards of the Windwalker is going to take increased healing from all sources. Windwalker has definitely improved tenfold with the amount of utility that they can bring to a key. They were always pretty decent, but now you just have those extra reasons to bring them, aside from just their insane damage. Up there with the Havoc Demon Hunter and the Outlaw Rogue, Windwalker is also one of the most durable classes going into Dragonflight. They have a wide range of abilities to reduce any damage taken through obviously Touch of Karma, Dampen Harm, Diffuse Magic. You've got Fortified Brew now as well for Windwalker, and passive abilities like Bounce Back as well, which is going to reduce damage you take by 10% for 4 seconds whenever you take a hit that's going to deal more than 20% of your max health. Windwalker also has great mobility too. They obviously have access to Transcendence, they've got their rolls, they've got Tiger's Lust if they talent into it, and let's not forget Flying Serpent Kick too. They can dance around any floor mechanics if they need to, and catch up to the group if they ever do fall behind. The list really does go on for Windwalker. It is a jack of all trades. It brings everything to Mythic Plus, and it obviously complements very well the melee meta that we look like we are going into. So for the subs category for the DPS specs, I'm going to start with Unholy DK. Unholy DK is an absolute monster in AoE scenarios, especially with a coordinated group. They are literally untouched in mass AoE scenarios. They pump out some some ridiculous numbers. And to complement that as well, they have some great single target damage too. The damage profile of this spec is one of the best in the game at this current moment. They bring some unique utility as well. Obviously, through now having 2 death grips, they can displace mobs along with their Abomination's Limb, which is going to constantly pull in mobs every 1 second when you have that popped, and do some great damage as well. They have access to abilities like Blinding Sleet as well, which is obviously a frontal cone disorient, and then also can obviously talent into a single target stun as well through Asphyxiate. Coming into Dragonflight, Unholy and Frost as well, but we're talking about Unholy here. They are ridiculously tanky. They have gained loads coming into this expansion through obviously Icebound Fortitude, which they've been used to in previous expansions, along with Anti-Magic Shell for any magic damage they face. They can talent into Death Pact if they need a quick heal. And the main one is Will of the Necropolis, which is just insane for a DPS spec. Whenever they get low, they're going to take 40% less damage, which is going to save them in a lot of scenarios. Being a DK as well, you obviously have Anti-Magic Zone, which ties nicely into the utility aspect of the DK as well. Bringing that 20% DR for you and your group is going to be massive for those boss fights that put out some ridiculous damage, or even the trash mobs on a fortified week. So Unholy definitely has granted itself a spot on the subs bench, ready to be swapped into the meta at any point. Next, I actually want to put a range class in, the first bloody one we've got on this tier list, and that is going to be in the way of Demo Warlock. Demonology has a balanced damage profile across all types of fights. They're not so much reliant on their Demonic Tyrant anymore, which is quite nice for the spec, in that they have a more well-rounded damage profile where their core abilities are actually doing a lot of the work. Dreadstalkers are hitting like an absolute truck on single target and AoE, so you can imagine what that's like in a mass AoE scenario. They've got some great damage coming out from their Felguard, and obviously the new Guillotine ability as well, which even after the nerf still performs very well. Warlock in general isn't the greatest for utility. They do bring some very niche things to your party, obviously in the way of health stones. They have summons if for whatever reason you need to teleport out and change talents. They have Demonic Gateway, which can be used in some scenarios for skips, but obviously we're going to need to work those out. They have the different curses. They have Shadow Fury, which is actually a pretty slept on piece of utility in an AoE stun that can be talented into a 45-second cooldown. And obviously they bring a battle res to your group too. Warlocks in general have always been one of the tankiest classes in the game, and that has just solidified itself even more coming into Dragonflight. Their class tree really does look like a tank tree if you didn't see what the abilities were called. They have Dark Pact, which is just a massive absorb shield. They have Unending Resolve. They have passive mitigation through abilities like Soul Leech, and this can be bolstered up through talents like Fell Armor and Demon Skin. They have Soul Link as well, which is obviously going to split 10% of the damage you take with your pet. The list really goes on for the Demonology and Warlock in general. Their defensive abilities are pretty much unmatched in the game, and this is specifically going to help on very high keys, which is why I've put it on the subs bench. The final class I'm going to put on the subs bench is the Feral Druid. It's about time Feral had its spot in the limelight, pumping some incredible AoE damage. The only specs that can kind of compete on big AoE pools are the Unholy DK and the Windwalker Monk. Obviously they have just had a slight nerf, but I'm still going to put it on the subs bench. They have great single target damage as well through their Ferocious Bites and Rip damage. Their AoE, like I said, is bonkers, with big Rip damage coming from their Primal Wrath and Tear Open Wounds, which is the new talent. They're a pretty tanky spec as well, with short cooldowns like Bark Skin, which you can pop pretty much whenever you need. You've got Survival Instincts obviously as well as the Feral Druid, Nature's Vigil for extra healing, and obviously instant off heals with your regrowths. And if you ever need to, you obviously have Bear Form for that extra armor and extra health increase to survive any scary incoming damage. You have some pretty great utility as well as a Druid in general. You obviously bring Mark of the Wild, which is new to the class, which is a flat verse increase for your party, which is massive, especially if you don't already have a Druid. You have the off heals like I talked about. You can talent into abilities like Typhoon and Vortex if for whatever reason your group needs to kite. And then you can also talent into AoE stops like Disorienting Roar. Obviously this is on the GCD though, as you have to swap into Bear Form. Feral is definitely in a solid place coming into Dragonflight. I would personally love a Feral meta, but for now I'm going to leave it on the subs bench, ready to jump into the meta if any of the top specs do receive a nerf. Havoc. Finally, obviously we have the healers. For the meta healer, I'm obviously going to be putting in the Preservation Evoker, the new class coming into Dragonflight. A huge reason to be putting the Preservation into this meta tier is obviously that we don't have a Lust at this current point, so it was kind of narrowed down to Preservation or Chamois anyway. However, it definitely does hold its own in all other regards as well, with one of the best offensive profiles out of any of the healers, both in single target and AoE damage. They really contribute to a lot of your group's damage over the course of a key. Their AoE burst is insane. Obviously, having access to abilities like Fire Breath, they really do dish out some great AoE damage. They have competitive heals as well. Nothing that stands out, but it's definitely a viable healer. But it's definitely a viable healer with their direct healing abilities like Dream Breath. You've got Echo, Reversion, and obviously Spirit Bloom. You obviously have the Dragonflight ability, which is going to be a massive AoE heal for your group. It is a shame this doesn't do the damage of Deep Breath though, because that would be pretty PogChamp for the Preservation Evoker. They have a nice little external through Time Dilation, which if you're familiar with Brewmaster Monk, works similarly to their stagger mechanic. And then they actually have a group-wide external as well in the form of Rewind, which if your party does take a big chunk of damage and all your party is on low health, you just press this button. It's on a longer cooldown, but it's going to instantly heal your group up to max health as long as they were prior to the damage. They have great utility being an evoker as well, with abilities like Landslide, which is a mass root effect. They have their ratio abilities in Wing Buffet, which is going to knock enemies back similar to a Typhoon. They have another AoE interrupt through Tail Swipe, and the big one obviously being Zephyr, which is a big AoE damage reduction for your party. They can also talent into a mass stun effect from their Dreamflight ability. And obviously they have a pressing roar as well, which works very well in a coordinated group for extra CC. They also bring an AoE Enraged Dispel, which is a first for World of Warcraft. And like I mentioned, obviously the massive one is that they are one of the few classes that can bring lust to your party. Evokers in general are pretty tanky as well through passives like Tempered Scales. They obviously have their Obsidian Scales ability, which is a 30% damage reduction that lasts a long time as well. 12 seconds is pretty long for a 30% DR. And then obviously you can talent into this having 2 charges. The Preservation Evoker has insane mobility as well. They have 2 charges of their Hover, which also allows them to cast on the move. They have their Dreamflight ability, but you don't really want to be using this for its mobility aspect. You have Verdant Embrace, which allows you to quickly reposition. And you also have Rescue as well, which is nice if you ever see a teammate in trouble. So that is why I put the Preservation Evoker in the meta tier for the first season of Dragonflight. We'll quickly run over our last sub to put on the bench, which is obviously going to be the Restoration Druid. Again, amazing offensive output. I've seen Resto Druids sustain like 30k cat weaving on single target boss fights, which is obviously going to help massively to bring down those tyrannical bosses. They have one of the best damage profiles for a healer in single target and AoE damage through cat weaving, with big Moonfire damage and Sunfire damage in AoE scenarios. Obviously, the Restoration Druid focuses more on a heal over time kind of play style, and a massive plus for the Restoration Druid is obviously their external with Iron Bark, which is massive for tanks if they ever do need the help. They have great party-wide healing, whether it's stacked or spread healing. They have some decent single target heals as well through minor cooldowns like Nature's Swiftness, obviously just helping to keep those tanks alive, not that they really need it. Resto Druids have amazing utility for Mythic Plus as well. Obviously I mentioned the Mark of the Wild that they're now bringing. They obviously bring Stampeding Roar to your group. They've got a Curse Dispel, they've got an Enraged Dispel. They have CC in the form of Mass Entanglement. You've got Vortex or Typhoon to help out with any kiting if you need. And now they also have access to Skull Bash, which is pretty massive, having a kick as a healer, but most healers do now. However, the only drawback for this is obviously you have to jump into cat form or bear form for this ability to work, and it is quite a pricey talent in the talent tree. Obviously, being a druid, you also have a battle res as well, which is pretty huge for Mythic Plus. They have great defensives as well for themselves. Obviously, Bark Skin again on a 1-minute cooldown, and if you need to, just drop into bear form. Again, being a druid, they have great mobility through abilities like Wild Charge. You have passive movement speed as well through abilities like Feline Swiftness, and a lot of your abilities are instant cast as well, so you're never really going to need to be just stood there casting in one place. You're always very mobile in that sense. Druids really are a jack of all trades, and that contributes massively to Mythic Plus, earning them a spot on the subs bench. And potentially they could even be meta if we weren't lacking a lust in the meta comp. So this is my meta comp. We've got the Prot Warrior, we've got a full melee stack with the Havoc Demon Hunter, Outlaw Rogue, Windwalker Monk, all complementing each other very well, dishing out amazing damage. They have incredible stops as well between all of them, whether it's single target stops with the Outlaw Rogue or AoE stops through the Havoc and Windwalker Monk. They're all up there with the tankiest specs in the game as well to survive those higher keys. And obviously you've got the Preservation Evoker just to complement this, which also brings the Lust, which is a massive pro to bringing in the Preservation Evoker with this comp. We have very solid specs in the sub tier as well. Vengeance could easily take Prot's place at a moment's notice. You've got these 3 DPS specs, which are all performing very well. They dish out some insane damage, some of the highest in the game, that's for sure. Demo is probably the only one that I could consider swapping out with a meta spec purely for the reason that it brings a battle res, which is obviously massive, but I assume that we're still going to have an engineering battle res, so we'll have to see how that plays out. Otherwise, Demo could definitely be up there. And you've got Resto as well, which is putting out some great offensive damage and also some very respectable healing. So that is my opinion on what is going to be the meta for the first season of Dragonflight. Let me know what you think I got wrong or what I got right, what classes you would like to see in the meta, or tell me why Survival Hunter actually deserves a spot in the meta. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to drop a like below and drop your boy a sub. And until next time, catch you later.